do more to get the rubber we're used to today. Early Mesoamericans improved the rubber slightly by mixing the latex with juice from the tropical morning glory, a local flower, and they used this to form sandals, bottles, and balls.
But for the next 3,000 years, to the rest of the world, rubber was little more than a curiosity. Then, in 1770, a piece of natural latex made its way to English chemist Joseph Priestley. And he took this piece and used it to try to erase pencil marks. He noticed that it easily, quote, rubbed them away.
In the following decades, people started exploring other applications. Up until then, people used to waterproof fabric with oil, wax, or tar. But some oils were extremely flammable and prone to spontaneous combustion, and wax or tar would eventually crack with movement. Similarly, there were no real good flexible materials at the time. Leather was the best option, but it had little give. Rubber had the potential to fix all those problems, so for the next 50 years, the use of rubber exploded. In England, people made waterproof clothing, and by the late 1820s, the rubber craze hit the US when everyone wanted their own pair of Brazilian waterproof boots. Factories sprang up all across the country to make new rubber products, including one New England factory called the Roxbury India Rubber Company.
In the spring of 1834, things were looking great for the company. The previous fall, they had sold over $20,000 worth of goods, rubber coats, shoes, and the like. But as the summer came round, problems started to emerge.
They used to rubberize the fabric to make it water resistant, which was fine until you sat down on a wooden bench on a hot day and you stuck to it.
See, all natural rubber has a critical weakness. It's extremely sensitive to temperature changes. It melts when it gets too hot, and it freezes and becomes brittle when it gets too cold.
This made the coats and shoes practically useless during the hot summer, so customers returned their items en masse.
Then things went from bad to worse. One day, the Roxbury manager visited the warehouse. When he opened the door, he didn't see their newest products. Instead, he was met with a foul smell and a molten, gooey mess that covered the entire warehouse. In fact, when we ordered some raw rubber, we were in for a similar nasty surprise.
Oh, that is disgusting.
The summer heat melted their rubber products, and they started rotting. The sludge stank so badly, the manager had the employees secretly bury it at night.
But later in that horrible summer, the manager got a visit from a man named Charles. Charles' previous business had gone bankrupt, and he was deeply in debt.
He stumbled upon a rubber life preserver, and he thought he could make a better valve.
He pitched the Roxbury manager on his new design, hoping to pay back his lenders. The manager was impressed, but couldn't buy Charles's work. He showed Charles the warehouse full of rotten rubber. Rubber had potential, but in its current form, it was just too problematic. However, he said if anyone could figure out how to make rubber stable in a wider temperature range and non-sticky, well, then that person would stand to make a ton of money. So Charles was determined to become that person. But when he returned home to start his experiments, he was met by an angry creditor who threw Charles into debtor's prison for unpaid loans. Charles asked his wife to bring him raw rubber and her rolling pin. There, in his jail cell, he started adding different compounds into raw rubber.
If rubber was naturally sticky, then why couldn't you add dry powders to absorb that stickiness? So he tried adding magnesia, and he got a smooth, non-sticky rubber. But over time, the stickiness returned. After his release, he tested the wear and tear of his rubber compounds by walking around in all rubber outfits.
His hands were always covered with gum elastic. He playfully said that the only way to rub rubber off was by rubbing more on.
Some mixtures showed promise, but eventually they'd all rot into a sticky mess. So he kept borrowing money to fund his experiments, but because his mixtures all eventually failed, he ended up in debtor's prison so many times that he jokingly called it his hotel.
But Charles refused to give up. When a friend told him rubber is dead, Charles replied, "I am the man to bring it back." In the summer of 1838, he met Nathaniel Hayward, a businessman and inventor. Hayward had done his own experiments with rubber. At one point, he laid out a sheet of rubber and sprinkled on sulfur powder. And when he let this sheet set in the sun, he noticed that it hardened and had a smooth and non-sticky surface.
but eventually it would still melt in the heat and freeze in the cold. He offered his process to his previous company, but it was so horribly smelly that they rejected it. But Charles saw the possibilities, so he helped Hayward get a patent, and then he bought it so that he could use it in his own experiments. Then one day in the winter of 1839, Charles accidentally dropped a piece of rubber mixed with sulfur on a hot stove. When he went to scrape it off, he found that instead of melting, it had charred and hardened. His daughter later said, "As I was passing in and out of the room, I casually observed the little piece of gum which he was holding near the fire, and he was unusually animated by some discovery which he had made. He nailed the piece of gum outside the kitchen door in the intense cold. In the morning, he brought it in, holding it up exultingly. He had found it perfectly flexible, as it was when he put it out." So he had made a new rubber with completely different properties, one that seemed to be temperature resistant and much stronger. In fact, we're going to test out unprocessed rubber against rubber processed in this way.
Okay, so this is uncured rubber, and I'm gonna see how far I can pull it.
Uncured rubber is very soft and stretches really far before easily breaking.
It's gonna hurt.
We need to cure it.
What does it smell like to you?
Smells like a barbecue.
This smells like a barbecue.
The smell of rubber does not seem to be natural. Like it smells very chemically, like it was made in the factory.
Yeah, so when I was in the factory and I saw the natural rubber, it smelled just like a barbecue. And the reason is they take the sap from the rubber tree, which is latex, and then they smoke it.
They're smoking it?
Yeah.
Like you'd smoke some salmon?
Yeah.
They smoke the rubber sheets to get rid of excess moisture and to preserve it by getting rid of the bacteria. This gives most natural rubber a sort of brownish color.
So, step one, add the rubber. One at a time.
Next, you add several powders, including sulfur. Everything is mixed and heated to get a much stronger rubber.
Just pull it straight off. That's what.
Yeah, we can go.
Pretty tough.
It is tough, eh? Now it's like wicked hard, yeah.
Now, at 393 kilopascals, the uncured rubber broke after extending just under 900% of its original length. At the same stress, the cured rubber had only stretched around 5%. It eventually broke at 14.1 megapascals, after stretching nearly 600% of its original length. So what was it about sulfur and heat that changed the properties so dramatically?
Well, chemically, sulfur powder is just rings of 8 sulfur atoms. On the hot stove, the sulfur ring broke apart into smaller pieces. And now those sulfur atoms, or sulfur chains, have free bonding sites, so they look for places to attach. What likely happened is they grabbed onto a carbon atom from a rubber chain, breaking its double bond and attached itself. Then with another free bonding site, it grabbed onto a carbon atom from a different rubber chain, breaking its double bond and linking the two rubber chains together. This cross-linking forms flexible bridges of 1, 2, or even more sulfur atoms in a row. Now think about what this does to the rubber. Instead of each chain being loose and slippery like spaghetti, they're tied together in a flexible but connected network. So now, if rubber sits out in the sun on a hot summer's day, the tight bonds prevent it from melting. And in the cold, the cross-links make it harder for the rubber to fully freeze, so it's less brittle and harder to break. And when you pull on the rubber, the chains stretch just as before, but as you release it, everything returns to its original position because it's all connected. So the crosslinks make the rubber stronger, more resistant to temperature changes, and more elastic. In fact, by tweaking the number and properties of these crosslinks, you can change the properties of rubber. If you have a lot of crosslinks, all the rubber chains are bound tightly together, so the rubber becomes harder and stiffer. Great for things like shoe soles and tires that need to be durable but still a little flexible. If you have shorter crosslinks, each link is harder to break, so the rubber is more resistant to heat and weathering. This is useful for seals and insulators. And if you have longer crosslinks, the rubber chains can move more freely, so you can stretch it more before it breaks. That's perfect in the medical field for soft and flexible applications.
So the crosslinks are essential to stabilizing rubber.
When Hayward sprinkled sulfur powder on rubber sheets, the heat from the sun did cause some cross-linking, but only on the surface. When Charles kneaded in sulfur and then heated the entire mixture, the cross-links grew throughout the entire sample. So now the results were much better. Eventually, this process was called vulcanization, after the Roman god Vulcan, who was associated with heat and sulfur in volcanoes.
Over the next 5 years, Charles perfected his method of vulcanization, and then he patented it in 1844. With this, he transformed rubber from a curiosity into a material of endless possibilities.
Little did he know that he actually wasn't the first to discover it.
The Mayans or the Aztecs created rubber. Were they also vulcanizing rubber, or was this
They actually were.
In fact, Charles' discovery was very similar to what the Mesoamericans had been doing for thousands of years. They'd taken the juice from the morning glory, which contained sulfur, mixed it with natural latex, and then by laying it out in the sun, it would heat up and actually naturally create the crosslinks that he discovered in his kitchen.
Why did the Europeans, why did they have to reinvent the whole thing? Why did they just ask them?
Well, they hadn't even noticed, I don't think.
No.
In the decades after Charles's invention, tons and tons of products were invented or improved with rubber.
Richards makes bold claim he could cross Pacific in this outfit.
The inflatable bicycle tire arrived in 1888, the first rubber gloves for medical purposes in 1890, and the first car tire in 1895. And all of this was thanks to Charles' invention.
But despite almost single-handedly transforming the rubber industry, he never made much money. I mean, he spent thousands of dollars defending his inventions in patent disputes. And when he passed away in 1860 at the age of 59, he was over $200,000 in debt. That would be around $7.7 million today.
38 years later, American entrepreneur Frank Sieberling founded a tire company and decided to name it in honor of rubber's inventor, Charles Goodyear. Today, the Goodyear company makes $18.9 billion a year in revenue, and it's the third largest tire manufacturer in the world. For the past 100 years, tires have consumed the most natural rubber out of any application. But vulcanized rubber alone isn't strong enough and would wear down quickly, lasting only around 8,000 kilometers. So in the early 1900s, car and tire companies started experimenting with additives, including something called carbon black.
So in natural rubber, we got carbon black reinforcement, which is going to add the cross-linking. This doesn't do the cross-linking. No, it doesn't? So this is the reinforcement and filler. This makes it durable and resilient.
Nowadays, passenger car tires last about 100,000 kilometers. Carbon black is what gives them their color and durability.
But carbon black has another benefit. It conducts electricity.
That's hugely important because as you're driving down the road, you're charging up the vehicle. If you didn't dissipate that static charge, then you would get a shock when you earth the car, when you touch the car.
But later, some companies wondered if they could reduce rolling friction by using a different additive. So they tried silica instead, making a whitish-looking tire. But silica is a poor conductor, and rubber itself is an insulator. So now, as the car moved, it would slowly build up charge.
As you go to refuel the car, you have a highly charged, static electricity charged vehicle. You put an earthed conductor, the fuel hose, into the tank. You create a spark in the tank, car explodes. There's a very vital characteristic of tires is that they should be conductive. The other benefit is if you're in a thunderstorm and you're struck by lightning, the lightning will hit the car, it will act as a Faraday cage, it will completely protect you, and it will dissipate down to the ground.
So people have stuck to using carbon black for most of the tire and only a little silica in the treads.
And since Goodyear's invention, we've made over 70 billion tires. If they were stacked on top of each other, they could go to the moon and back 21 times.
And almost all of these tires needed natural rubber. But fueling the rubber boom came at a price, especially early on. In the late 19th century, the Amazon region supplied over 90% of the world's rubber. But wild rubber trees were often separated by hundreds of meters. So to keep up with growing demand, rubber barons began to exploit natives, killing roughly 40,000 people in the Putumayo region alone, and likely over 100,000 across the wider Amazon region between 1879 and 1911. The humanitarian activist Roger Casement said that it was first called India rubber because it came from the Indies, and the earliest European use of it was to rub out or erase. It is now called India rubber because it rubs out or erases the Indians.
is one of the most appalling instances of genocide and sickening ill treatment of native peoples.
But other countries like England weren't happy with Brazil's monopoly. So in 1876, the biopirate Henry Wickham managed to smuggle 70,000 rubber seeds back to England. The British Empire planted these seeds all over Southeast Asia, which had a similar climate. Only now, instead of having just a few rubber trees here and there, they made farms of acres and acres of nothing but rubber trees. These plantations produced far more than the Amazon. Brazil's share of the rubber supply dropped from over 80% in 1907 to 1.6% just over 3 decades later. By the mid-1930s, over 90% of all rubber came from the British colonies in Southeast Asia. And 2/3 of that rubber went into making car tires. One of the largest car manufacturers at the time was Ford, which made an average of 1.5 million cars every year. And Henry Ford wasn't comfortable with England's monopoly. So in 1928, he bought 10,000 square kilometers of land from the Brazilian government to build a utopian town. He called it Fordlandia. It had Cape Cod cottages, a hospital, swimming pools, a golf course, and little red fire hydrants. It was an American city in the middle of the Amazon. It could house 10,000 people, all working to plant millions of rubber trees.
Ford Plantation is a successful enterprise, a tribute to skill and science.
But in the early 1930s, things started to go wrong. Every morning, the workers would wake up, walk to the line of rubber trees, and they'd notice black spots. Just a few at first, little specks on the undersides of the leaves, like flecks of soot, but by the afternoon, they'd spread to cover the leaves entirely. And the next morning, the leaves were falling off. Shortly after that, the tree died. Every day, another row of trees was infected and dying.
People who've seen it say it looks like a fire front. You have the infected trees, and it's green on one side and black on the other. And you see that black line move day by day. You could virtually watch it move, leaving dead trees behind it.
The trees were infected by the South American leaf blight, a fungus native to South America. This blight ruined the 3.6 million rubber trees from Ford's plantations by the early 1940s, turning it into a disaster. When planting his rubber trees, instead of separating them by hundreds of meters like they were in the wild, he planted them several meters apart, 200,000 of them.
They're all touching. The roots are touching, the leaves are touching, the branches are touching. And so it's just like a plague runs straight through the plantation.
Ford tried relocating the project to a town downstream, Belterra, planting another 16,000 acres with rubber trees. But these too all died. Ford's son eventually abandoned the project in 1945. The Fordlandia buildings still stand in Brazil, abandoned. And to this day, there is no cure for the leaf blight. The blight is so fatal to rubber trees, they can't grow in plantations in their native country. That's why South America makes up less than 2% of the rubber supply. Over 90% comes from Asia, which is why it is so essential to prevent the spread of the leaf blight to Southeast Asia. Virtually all of the rubber trees in Southeast Asia came from those seeds Henry Wickham stole, and newer trees are just clones of the old ones. So the farms are essentially just one big monoculture.
As a consequence of that, we are particularly prone to potential outbreaks of funguses and things like that. If you get a fungal infection in Malaysia, then you would end up dramatically reducing global production of rubber.
So what's the outcome if we were cut off from rubber?
If SAL gets established in Southeast Asia and you lose natural rubber, then you're talking about a complete global societal meltdown. You're left now with making synthetic rubber tires at the most. Worst case, they can't make them. You can't make a truck tire. You won't have any airplanes. But the real potential is urban famine. Over 50% of the world's population is in cities. How will you move food into the cities to feed them?
But something like this did wipe out a large part of the rubber supply just 6 years ago.
In 2019, 2 different diseases jumped from palm trees to rubber trees in Thailand.
In 6 months, these diseases had spread across 7 countries and 1 million acres of trees. And the next year saw a 10% drop in production.
And the only reason it didn't destroy more trees was because of a different outbreak that we all remember.
COVID comes in early 2020. It stopped the spread of these diseases as a byproduct of trying to stop the spread of COVID. If COVID hadn't hit there, how far would that have gone? How many more millions of acres would have, in effect, been killed or seriously compromised by these two leaf blights?
Granted, it's hard to predict what would happen if we ran out of natural rubber. Some say the impact could be catastrophic. Grounded planes, failed railways, even famine. And any disruption to the oil supply chain would send shockwaves through synthetic rubber products. But oil is such a polarizing and politically charged topic, deeply tied to global power struggles and hidden incentives, that it's hard to know what's truly at stake. That's why we specifically asked Ground News to sponsor this video. They gather news sources from around the world in one spot, so you can read about the same issue from different perspectives with the context needed to separate facts from politics. For example, Iran controls a single strait that handles roughly 20% of the world's oil. What happens when they threaten to close it amid US strikes on their nuclear sites? Well, on the topic, USA Today ran, "Oil hits 5-month high after US strikes key Iranian nuclear sites." But the New York Post led with, "US stocks surge after restrained Iran attack on US base." One headline warned of a looming energy crisis, the other, stock market rally and strategic restraint. It's the same event, but completely different conclusions. In times of uncertainty, knowing who is telling you the story and why is just as important as knowing what actually happened. Ground News helps you do that by showing you the split headlines and surfacing stories hidden from your usual news feeds due to bias through their blind spot feed. In fact, the Nobel Peace Center called Ground News an excellent way to stay informed, avoid echo chambers, and to expand your worldview. And I agree. If we want to properly understand the crises affecting us here at home and around the world, we need better tools. And I can't recommend Ground News as that tool enough. So visit ground.news/BE or scan the QR code here to subscribe for a 40% discount off their Vantage plan, but only with our link, ground.news/BE. I'd like to thank Ground News for sponsoring this video, and now, back to rubber.
We take natural rubber for granted in a huge number of different products. So if you take a typical car, there's something close to 250 to 300 rubber components within the car. You would have a nightmare trying to re-engineer all of those out of synthetic materials.
If we were to lose natural rubber and just rely on synthetic rubber, would it still be possible to do those applications?
So this has happened in the past. If you think about it, all of these synthetic polymers come from that initial thought process that we can't get natural rubber, we have to create other stuff. It's a national security issue.
That's wild.
You're just like, oh, it's a tire, but think about it, if you don't have tires, you can't move a military.
Yeah.
The obvious question is, if natural rubber is so great, why can't we just replicate it in the lab? And that's the exact thing that the US tried when during the Second World War, Japan cut it off from roughly 97% of the world's natural rubber supply.
Modern wars cannot be won without rubber.
What then happened was an enormous investment by the US, equivalent to $11.1 billion in today's terms, into synthetic rubber and growing alternative natural rubber crops.
That's roughly a third of the Manhattan Project. It was a complete gamble, but the 4 big US tire companies were able to improve and manufacture a synthetic rubber called styrene butadiene in less than 3 years. Unlike natural rubber, styrene butadiene is made from 2 monomers, roughly 25% styrene and 75% butadiene. Both usually come from crude oil refining. The monomers are dispersed in water and combine into long chains in a random arrangement. Then the rubber is vulcanized. Now, compared to natural rubber, it doesn't wear down as quickly under friction, but it has a much lower tensile strength. In 1942, the US used 99.6% natural rubber and 0.4% synthetic. But in 1945, it was practically reversed at 14% natural and 86% synthetic. Now almost 70% of all rubber consumed is synthetic, and the most common one is still styrene butadiene. But there are some things that natural rubber is just better at.
If you think about airplane tires, it's absolutely incredible that they're up there at umpteen degrees below zero before they start to come into land. And then you've got this huge weight of the airplane on these dinky little tires that increase in temperature enormously over an incredibly small space of time. And only natural rubber can do it. So airplane tires are essentially 100% natural rubber. And you can't land if you've got synthetic in the tire.
So what can natural rubber do that we just can't replicate?
Okay, what I want you to think about is you start to stretch it. This first movement, it's very easy to stretch that bit. That first bit, very simple. Now, think about how much force you're using to continue to stretch it.
Yeah, it gets harder.
It gets harder and harder and harder and harder.
Yeah,
and then eventually you'll get to a break point.
Yeah.
But what's happening, why it's getting harder, is that the rubber is getting stronger as you stretch it.
As you stretch the polymers, they start to align and stick together through weak intermolecular forces called van der Waals forces. When they are packed tightly enough, the polymers freeze together in thin sheet-like crystals aligned in the direction you stretch. And as you keep pulling, more and more polymers join the crystal structure. Each crystal acts as a new crosslink, making